From the EPR Creation Studio, this is Unconquered with Doc Staples. As always, this podcast brought to you by EPR Creations, bringing you the best of internet development and website marketing for an affordable price, and by Shenandoah Newsma of Shenandoah Real Estate in the Research Triangle of North Carolina, by Louis Marquez of Momentum Realty in Jacksonville, Florida, by Garage Makeovers, the #1 garage remodeling company in South Florida, and by Justin Galloway, bringing you a boutique, a wonderful experience guiding you through the maze of buying a home for Benchmark Mortgage, serving Florida, Tennessee, and Kentucky. And guys, this one, I told you I was probably going to take some time off during the open week and all of this, and this one came a little faster than expected because Florida State and Mike Norvell They pulled the trigger on some things that were going to happen after the season for sure, but they went ahead and got it done now, 3 weeks before I expected it to happen. So time to discuss some coaching stuff, and we will definitely discuss some potential replacements and things like that as we go along. But first thing I want to emphasize is that these changes were not forced. This was not a matter of anybody from Florida State, whether it's Alford or, high money people or whatever, coming to Mike Norvell and demanding that he make changes or else. These were changes that were going to be made. This has been in the works for over a month, well over a month in a couple cases, that these, I told y'all a while back, there were going to be sweeping changes and that the die had already been cast. And I know a number of you, just based on the interactions that I get and, stuff that you guys send me, a number of you didn't believe that and, continued to go with this narrative of Norvell being stubborn and unwilling to make changes or whatever. And I'm telling you, that's not Norvell. And the other thing that I'm going to say is that these three are not the only changes that are going to be made on this staff. They're just not. But these were the three that, at this point, were made now. That's basically what this boils down to. Now, I don't know whether this is true or not, but I wouldn't be surprised if there weren't a discussion or two about just going ahead and getting it done now rather than after the season, simply because essentially the natives were getting restless. And like, okay, well, we know that this is going to happen. I mean, obviously, Alford and some of the very top people knew, Norvell had already filled them in, like this is going to happen. And there's a certain point where it becomes, it's not like firing these three guys doesn't really make a difference for recruiting for next year. It doesn't help you for development. It doesn't really help the on-field football product in any way. I mean, I've talked about that for weeks. It doesn't really help you in that respect. The thing it does is it gives fans a pound of flesh and, some of the boosters and others some sense that, okay, well, real changes, substantive changes are going to be made. And so that's the real value at this point. But as far as recruiting and the rest, this doesn't help you. It doesn't do anything that, signals to recruits, whatever. None of that stuff is really important. This was simply done now because, again, after getting blown out once more and humiliated by Notre Dame, you got people who are saying, okay, look, what's the deal? You can't just keep not doing anything. And again, what I kept saying is you're going to play out the string either way. You can't make hires until after the season anyway. So what do? That's kind of where I come down on this in terms of the timing. As I said multiple weeks ago, though, if it had been me, I probably would have been hard pressed not to pull the trigger on firing Atkins and Dugans at least after the Duke game. Like, look, you can't have that kind of performance from your units over and over again in those kinds of contexts and not want to get those things and not be accountable for those things. Let's just put it that way. So if I'm Mike Norvell, I said it, like it would have been hard for me not to make those changes then. And I know that the last few weeks, it's been one of the things that has been so difficult on him is he's known that these changes were going to be made. And, firing someone is hard enough. Firing someone is really, really hard. Firing someone that you've worked together with closely for 5 years, and, coaching staffs become a family. I mean, your spouses spend time together. Your families spend time together. You're in all this together. And that makes it that much harder. And it's that much harder to fire good men. These are good human beings. These are not guys that are not, pleasant people. They're not, immoral people that you fire with prejudice, as one might say. It's hard to do, without question. I mean, you are, and don't get me wrong, these guys are all getting a lot of, I think the total severance pay that they're going to get because of guaranteed contracts is like $7 million. So I'm not crying for them and their family in terms of provision and all of that, but it does affect their kids. I mean, think about being a kid at school and, all the Florida State fans at your school, hate you because your dad has not been having success with his unit or whatever. I mean, these are the things that are just difficult about being family in college football. And again, Norvell, knowing that was going to happen. So not only do you've got to make that decision, but then you have to go to work with these guys every day for the next few weeks, for a couple months after you make that decision. So you're going to work day after day after day with a guy that you have respect for, that you love and like his family. And then you also know you're also going to have to terminate. That's a really hard place to live for months. And then you get to, a lot of people have talked about how Norvell looks dead inside on the sideline and all that. Y'all, the thing I want to explain here, this is not him being dead or, that something broke inside him or whatever, he's broken or whatever. This is a guy who burns at 3,000 degrees inside, doing everything he can not to just explode at every moment on the sideline and in interviews and in everything else, and just go ballistic at every single thing that happens. I mean, he's trying to hold that together, and the inward burning is kind of consuming him from the inside there. So one thing that this does for him is it does relieve some of that pressure, releases some of that pressure in that, okay, well, that part's done. And that probably does help the overall mental health or inward sort of difficulty, struggle as you're going through that on his end. But yeah, that's kind of where they are. And, these were changes that did need to be made. And, I have a lot of respect for Ron Dugans. I've talked about this in the past. Ron was one of the guys who, helped me when I was in high school, when I camped at Florida State. And then when I got to Florida State and started on as a walk-on, my first year as a walk-on, Ron and Peter Warwick helped me. I mean, those guys were kind. They understood the craft, and, were helpful to somebody who is as low on the totem pole as me. I will never not appreciate those guys and more. I mean, guys like Anquan Bolden, who, remains one of the people I have the most respect for in this game. A guy who, day after day took me under his wing, even though he's only a couple years older than me, was a wonderful teammate to me and lots of other guys on that team. That's a guy I will always have a ton of respect for. And Ron is a guy I'm always going to respect. I'm always going to have a lot of respect for. But the truth is, again, you are what your unit says you are, and Florida State's receivers have just not been good enough, and the development has not been there in key spots when guys aren't blocking like they're supposed to. I mean, you can't go out and catch for them. Now, there are certain things you can do to help guys catch better. I mean, I've coached that position. I've worked very hard to get guys to where they catch better, and I do think you can see certain results. And I've got my own beliefs on certain drills and the efficacy of them, and certain drills that I don't think are important. And sometimes, I see stuff from different practices and I roll my eyes or whatever because I don't like that drill. I mean, every coach is that way. But I have a lot of respect for Ron, and I'm sorry to see him get fired. But again, it needed to be done. The proof was in the pudding, and it was just not enough. And the same is true for Atkins. Look, Atkins is a good human being, y'all. He's a guy that, you want on your coaching staff. He's got, his family, quality. These are quality people. And, Atkins knows ball. This is not a guy who's incompetent. And, I do hope that despite the show cause, he's able to find his feet somewhere else. And I think he'll be successful in this game moving forward. Sometimes it just doesn't work in a given place at a given time with the surroundings that you have or whatever else. But, that's a guy that I'm going to wish the best for moving forward. He's a guy I have a lot of respect for. And then, Fuller has been successful at different places. And I've talked about how, he has struggled in terms of connection, in terms of recruiting and all of that. He's, a little bit more, has a little bit more difficulty on those things. But I mean, again, these are good men. It's a hard thing. So anybody who's cheering, firings and all of that, always take that into consideration. These people are human beings, and these three, these guys are, good men with families. So that part always needs to be taken into account. Now, again, all three of these guys needed to go. And, honestly, Fuller is a guy that I probably would have parted ways with after 2021. Truth is. Now, 2023, that will always be, in my view, one of the best defenses in Florida State history. That will always be a defense that, I think that defense when they were at full strength was probably the best defense in the country. And so, you give him credit for that. He helped put that together. But I do think that just in terms of his approach and all of that, it required too many pieces to be perfect for it to be the solution moving forward. And my take on Fuller for a long time, and this is something that, in text conversations with other people and all of that for some years, what we've talked about is Fuller an elite defensive coordinator? No. Is he a top-level recruiter? No. Then getting paid what he's getting paid at Florida State is probably not right. Because you're a top program, you need to have a top-level defensive coordinator, a guy who is first-rate at, really, you want a first-rate at both of those things, but he's got to be at least first-rate at one of them. If you're not going to be a great recruiter, you'd better be an elite defensive coordinator. And if you're not going to be an elite coordinator, then you need to be one of those guys that players really, really want to sign up to play for you. And, Fuller was neither. And that's ultimately, I think, why he wound up, having to move on. You're looking at a guy that just, he's a good coach. He's a good coordinator. Is he an elite guy? No. And I think Florida State right now, they need an elite guy. Now, the hard part about this is coming off of what's likely to be a 2-10 season. And yes, I do think Florida State's going to beat Charleston Southern. Coming off of that season, and, given the situation that Norvell's in, how difficult is it going to be to attract a top-level coordinator candidate? I mean, you think about some of the guys on my list who would be on my list for sure, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. I'm not sure how many of them are leaving their current situation to go to Florida State, knowing that, Norvell, despite what happened last year, has burned through a lot of goodwill. And, that seat is warm. Now, Florida State is not in a position to be able to pay that buyout realistically, and they shouldn't be thinking about paying that buyout. And, my advice on this is stay the course, and, Norvell should have two more years at minimum. I mean, I think Florida State trying to make a move at the head coaching position before, say, 2027, if things just really weren't happening, I think, making a move after 2025 would be stupid, because again, you're overpaying people not to coach for you. And in today's game, more than ever, it's about being able to sustain the budget you need to have the roster handled. And, this is something that Coach Bowden understood so well. I mean, he said so many times that the secret to being a great coach is having better players than the coach on the other sideline. That's it. And so, if you're Florida State, if you're Mike Norvell right now, first of all, your priority has to be to get coaches that are going to attract better players than the other coaches, than the coaches that you're going to be facing. Number one. Now, that has to be paired with guys who are going to develop that talent when they arrive. This is not a matter of like one or the other. You have to have guys that can do both. But if you're looking at a question of, okay, I can have an A-level recruiter who's a B-plus developer, or I can have a B-plus recruiter who's an A developer, right now you probably go with that A recruiter, because at the end of the day, it's a lot easier to develop A-level talent. If you start with a guy who's an A, it's a lot easier to make him an A+ than it is to take a guy who's a B and make him an A. Right? So if you're Florida State, the way you've got to think about this is, regardless of who's coaching, who the head coach is, an average coach is going to look much better coaching a bunch of straight studs on offense or on defense than a great coach coaching a bunch of average players. That's this game, y'all. That's college football. It's about players more than anything else. And, look, I love scheme. I'm a scheme junkie. I love that stuff as much as anybody. But at the end of the day, like, look, you're not winning the Kentucky Derby on a mule. You got to have thoroughbreds. And that really, I mean, we've talked about that since the first game of this season. The hot takes after that Georgia Tech game, you can go back to that and go, my concern right there was, who are the difference makers on this team? Who scares another team? Who's the playmaker who's going to change the game for you? And general rule of thumb is, on defense, you want at least one at every level, and ideally you need more than one on the defensive line. And then on offense, you've got to have a stud wide receiver, and you've got to have somebody who can change the scoreboard at running back if you're going to be average everywhere else. And this was one of the real problems that Florida State had this year, is they've got a pretty deep roster of guys who can play at the Power 4, Power 3 level. But who are the real difference makers? Who are the guys that change the math for you, who change the scoreboard on offense and create havoc on defense? And there aren't very many names that come into that picture, are there? So that's what's got to change. So they got to find people who are going to be able to do that. That's your priority. And again, this is why I've stuck to my guns on this, saying paying $65 million, or after 2026, $54 million or whatever it is after 2025, and then $45 million after 2026. Paying those kinds of figures $9-10 million a year for someone not to coach for you when you can take that same $8 or $9 million, $10 million a year and just put it towards your roster. Even an average coach is going to look better with that extra $10 million roster than a great coach who doesn't have it. And there's no guarantee you're going to hire a great coach. So, again, and you know that you've got a coach who's been able to win 19 straight games. So you've got a guy who's demonstrated that he can do that. To me, you've got to just you've got to put all of that towards your program to put the quality pieces around, and I think that's the only viable way forward. Now, I'm going to give some preliminary thoughts here on potential hires in terms of offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator, and wide receivers. So we'll talk through that. And I know there's going to be tons of these hot boards. I think one of the things that is going to be difficult about this in terms of hot boards and all of that is that Mike Norvell is ultimately the one that's making all these calls. And he's not exactly going to be showing his hot board to everybody else. He's not going to be showing his list to a bunch of people and talking about like, okay, here's the 4 or 5 guys that, are on my list. That's not how this works. That is just not how this works. So the best we can do is look at who's actually really viable quality coaches and all of that. And then what connections do they have to Mike Norvell? If I'm Norvell, I'm probably going to try to work within my network because my network is really good. And this is one of those things that, you kind of, a lot of people forget. A lot of people forget that, Dan Lanning is in the Mike Norvell coaching tree. And so when you start questioning who is he going to hire at defensive coordinator, for example, I think you probably look at 2 things. You look at, first of all, the Dan Lanning tree of defense and find a guy who is basically a young Lanning protege. I think that's one thing that if I'm Mike Norvell, I'm looking closely at. And the second thing I would be looking at is the Mike Elko tree. Who's in the Mike Elko tree that is young, is an Elko protege, and has had a lot of success. And the other thing is that a lot of times offensive coaches will also look at defensive coordinators who've given them the most trouble and say, okay, that guy was really, really good with what he had. So that's kind of what I would factor on in terms of starting my kind of presumed hot board for what I would expect from Norvell. Now, one thing I do think you're likely to see in this case is I don't think you're going to see, this is just, again, I am not in Mike Norvell's inner circle to discover exactly how he's thinking about this. So this is just me giving my thoughts. But if I'm Norvell, one of the things that I'm looking at here is I want to hire ideally, I want to hire a young coordinator who has proven that he is a top shelf coordinator rather than hiring, some position coach or understudy to somebody who has not run a defense before. This is a situation where you've got to flip things quick and you're going to need somebody who can walk in the door and has done this. So I think you're going to hire a sitting defensive coordinator somewhere or someone who has been a coordinator somewhere and then is, maybe a co somewhere else. So, you look at a guy like Chris Hampton, who's right now Oregon co-defensive coordinator. He's a defensive backs coach there. If you look at Chris Hampton, he's now in the Dan Lanning tree. He's helping run Dan Lanning's defense. Is he calling those defenses? No. But he does have defensive coordinator experience at Tulane. So maybe that's a guy that, okay, he's right now not a coordinator. I can turn over the defense to him, and I know he's going to walk in and be able to coordinate because he's done it before. But I would want to talk to somebody. I would want to talk to Lanning and say, yo, is he really a guy I want to turn my keys over to? And if I don't get an A+ sign off from Lanning, I'm moving on. But that's one guy who's not currently a sitting coordinator that, is a former coordinator who's run it before. But I don't think you're looking at guys who are, like a Derek Nicholson right now. You're going to see his name show up on a lot of these lists because, he's a former Florida State player. He's young. He can recruit. He's, been consistently, he's consistently had good linebackers wherever he's been when he's coached them. But is he calling defenses at Miami? No. Has he called defenses before? Well, he was co-defensive coordinator at Southern Miss, but he's not run his own show, not fully. And if I'm Norvell, I'm not sure I'm willing to roll the dice like that. Just not. That's less likely to me. Now, a couple other guys that I would very much look at. I would look at Tyler Santucci from Georgia Tech. He's from the Elko tree. He was under Elko at Texas A&M, under Jimbo and Elko at Texas A&M for several years. Then when Elko went to Duke, he ran the Duke defense. And, Elko, of course, is instrumental in all that, but Santucci was running those defenses. And then look at the turnaround this year with Georgia Tech under Santucci versus the prior year versus last year, where they were one of the worst defenses in the country in terms of stopping the run and struggled in all sorts of ways. Santucci comes in and they flip it. Santucci would be right up there toward the top of my list because that's a young guy. And that's a guy I think is going to be able to recruit. And he's been in your conference for a while. His defenses have given you some trouble. Santucci would be high on my list. Now, the question is, does Santucci want to move on from a Georgia Tech spot where they're on the upswing and, take roll the dice to make a shift in your own conference toward a place that's maybe a little bit less job security? But Santucci would be toward the top of my list. So that's one. Obviously, I mentioned Chris Hampton. He's another guy that would be. I would talk to Lanning. I'd find out. What do you think? Is he a guy that you would hire if you were in my boots? I think Santucci is probably more of a guarantee because of what the turnaround that we've seen in what he's done. And again, his defenses are really well coordinated and coached. After that, Scott Simons, the SMU defensive coordinator, who just gave you a bunch of trouble, and he's been really, really good for the last couple of years. And he's in your network. You hired him. He's a guy that has actually been on your staff before. Maybe you look at bringing him in because he was Memphis's linebackers coach under Norvell right before Norvell took the Florida State job a couple of years before. So maybe Scott Simons. But here's the thing. SMU is on the upswing, and SMU is going to pay a lot of money to keep their coaches right now. I'm not sure you can get Simons, but he'd be probably top 3 or 4 on my list. Another guy that I'd actually at least investigate would be another guy that's right now under Elko, and that's Jay Bateman. Now, I know Jay and have a lot of respect for Jay Bateman as a defensive mind, and he is a great recruiter. I mean, a great recruiter. So, I would investigate Jay Bateman and see if, maybe he was interested in coming on board. But again, the problem there, he's at Texas A&M, and A&M's been pretty good this year. And what do you do? And Bateman, by the way, was the linebackers coach at Florida last year, just for full explanation. And look at the backers that Florida landed. I mean, again, the guy can flat out recruit. But if you're Bateman, do you want to leave a pretty ideal situation at Texas A&M right now to take the gamble at Florida State? where, at Texas A&M, you're in a first-year coaching staff. You've got probably 3 years before any seat sort of starts to get hot there, likely. And they're on the upswing, and Elko's probably going to have some success. Bateman is on the, future head coach trajectory. And he's a guy, actually, honestly, I would look at as a future head coach. As a guy, he would be on my short list for places like North Carolina, for example, where he coached as a defensive coordinator before under Mac Brown. But he would be one of those guys I would actually look at as a head coach for, those kinds of programs in 3 or 4 years after being under Elko. So maybe he's not willing to make a move, but he's a guy I would talk to, because maybe he wants to run his own defense in Tallahassee instead of being, under Elko and the perception of just running Elko's defense at Texas A&M. That would be a third guy I would look at. And again, you're looking there, a top-notch scheme mind combined with a great recruiter. Some others, the Duke defensive coordinator this year under Manny Diaz. Look what they did to you in Durham with a bunch of guys that are not good enough to play at Florida State. Well, and he's been really, really, really good. So that's Jonathan Patke, who, he's been really solid, and he's worked in the SEC. He's worked, he was at Mississippi State with Manny. He understands how to recruit. So, that's another guy that I would be looking at. So, yeah, I mean, I those are just a few of the first names that would be on my list. Another few in terms of rapid fire, I would look at Lyle Hemphill, who is the defense coordinator and Nichols coach at James Madison. He was at Duke under Elko, where he was co-defensive coordinator with Santucci during the 2023 season, safeties coach at the time. And again, another Elko guy. And I think Elko's defense his defensive tree is really good. Now, Fuller ran a version of Elko's defense, but was not really an Elko protege. It would actually be a pretty smooth transition to bring in a guy who's an actual Elko protege to run basically the same terminology, same kind of defensive family, but more aggressive and, directly out of the Elko tree rather than what you got with Fuller. And if you can pair that with a guy who can really recruit, well, there you go. And by the way, Hemphill was a Wake Forest coach. He was at Dave Clawson. He was Dave Clawson's defensive coordinator, 2019 to 2021. And, Clawson is a guy I have a ton of respect for. I've talked to him some over the years, and that, again, the organization level, that sort of thing, he's a guy I would have on my list. Lyle Hemphill. And I got to see their defense firsthand, JMU, when they played North Carolina, and they were really well coached. So he's another guy I would have on that list. Now, again, those are just my preliminary thoughts. We'll see what Norvell actually does. But again, I think you're going to see him go out and hire from someone either who he has coached against or is largely in network, and someone who has clear experience recruiting in the region, and also clear experience as a play caller, as a defensive play caller himself, with proof of concept that guy can actually call. You can't afford to roll the dice too much here. You've got to go and get a proven guy. That doesn't mean necessarily a big name, but you got to get a guy that is going to walk in that door and fix things. Oh, and one last thing before I move on to the other spots. Fuller was not when I say Fuller was not an Elko protege, but is still connected to that kind of to Elko. They coached together in 2005 at Richmond, but neither was the defensive coordinator. So helpful to know. In any case, let's go ahead and move on to talking about the offensive side. Now, let's go ahead and talk a little bit of offensive coordinator and offensive line coach, since both of those positions, which were one position for Florida State staff, are now open after Atkins' termination. And part of this is complicated by the fact that you're going to have to figure out exactly where those pieces are going to fit on your offensive staff as a whole. I mean, who are you going to hire as an offensive coordinator? And I'll just say it this way. Wide receivers and offensive line are not the only positions on offense that are going to be determined or decided after the season when they're making these hires. And who you hire as a coordinator and what he is best at, what he wants to coach, is going to have some impact on where different guys wind up slotting in. So that's going to be difficult. That's going to be, I can't assess this quite as easily as the other side in terms of guys that I would just absolutely, okay, there's one, there's another. What I can do is talk about some of the guys in Norvell's network and some of the possibilities that we might see. So one is Garin Justice. He's an assistant head coach and offensive line coach at SMU. I think some of the same problems that you see with Simons there exist for Justice. Justice is a guy that does have Norvell connections. Norvell likes him a lot. There's a lot of respect there. But do you really want to leave SMU right now, given that SMU has very, very deep pockets and is about to probably win the ACC this year? Do you want to move on from there right now, or do you want to just stay put right now? Might be a tough sell to get somebody to go. And I know this sounds crazy, but again, look at where Florida State is right now. Look at where SMU is. Think about job security. Think about a lot of different things. That's a guy that would be on the list. But yeah. Another guy that would be on the list on the offensive line front is Applebaum. That's Matt Applebaum from right now at Georgia, or at Boston College, that is. He was with Miami Dolphins in 2022. He was at Boston College again under Hafley in 2020 and 2021. He's another guy where there's a lot of respect there between him and Norvell. Those are a couple, just sort of the first names on my head that would be possibilities, I would imagine, in terms of calls. I don't know that that's a that either one is where they'll wind up. I will say also, I see some people on social media and elsewhere suggesting that a guy like Chip Lindsey, who's at North Carolina, and North Carolina potentially having their staff, having a new staff next year, Chip Lindsey coming from the Malzahn tree would be a possibility. And I'm just going to tell you, don't expect that. And Lindsey would not be my hire for Florida State offensive coordinator, not in this situation at all. I don't think you would be looking at an upgrade there. I think you would get one name from the Norvell tree that I do think would be potentially viable here would be Kevin Johns, who's right now at Oklahoma as an offensive analyst and was at Duke under Elko when Duke was playing really well. And Johns is a good coach. He's a quarterback's coach by trade. And he was running Norvell's offense at Memphis when Norvell came to Florida State. So that's a guy that might be on the list. Here's why I don't think that's the likely hire, though, is when Norvell went from Memphis to Florida State, he could have brought Kevin Johns with him, and he didn't. So do you really think that his move now, when he absolutely has to hit a home run, is going to be Kevin Johns? Johns is a good coach, and we've seen it. He did well at Duke under Elko, but I don't expect that that's going to be the hire. I wouldn't complain if it was. I actually think Johns is a good coach, but that's a guy that I don't think is necessarily realistic there. Now, one name that you're going to see pitched around a bunch is Brennan Marion, who was a first-rate, I'm talking about A+ type wide receivers coach at Pitt and then at Texas before taking the UNLV offensive coordinator job, where he's now coaching quarterbacks as well. And he's got his own distinctive offense, the go-go offense, where they run basically it's essentially the old West Coast near-far formations in the backfield, running two backs in the near far type formational stuff out of shotgun spread. And otherwise, it's basically Norvell's offense. He's just doing some stuff with motion and formation that's a little bit different. He's a guy that I imagine will be in the discussion. I'm not sure that he's going to be likely to be the hire for a couple reasons. One is I think Marion is very possibly going to be getting some head coaching offers after this year. And another is, again, I'm just not sure that in terms of what he runs, it's going to, in terms of the exact stuff, that's exactly what Norvell's going to want to run next year. But it's possible. He's a guy that's going to be on that list. And again, if you bring him in, he might want to coach quarterbacks. I probably wouldn't want that. You could slot him in for Dugans at wide receiver and have him calling plays or have him coordinating the offense from there. Possible. But again, I'm not going to bank on that one. It's not one I would bet on. Two coaches, by the way, that I've seen, others mention as well. Now, let's bring in the possibility of wide receivers coach since I mentioned Marion. And obviously you have to replace Ron Dugans. I saw some people mention the current North Carolina wide receivers coach, Lonnie Galloway. That's a no, y'all. I would no. Norvell needs to do better in terms of a wide receivers coach. And look, Galloway's a good wide receivers coach. Norvell needs to do better for this. Let's see. Others in terms of that you might have a chance at. You've got Ross Douglas from Syracuse. He's a guy that has been an NFL receivers coach at New England. He's done well at Syracuse right now. He's 30 years old. He's probably going to be able to recruit. One concern you have there is he doesn't have naturally built recruiting network in the Southeast. So that's something you're going to have to consider here. There's also the possibility that they move Yak from running backs to wide receivers, where he's been a good wide receivers coach in the past, and they hire somebody like a Jawan Sider at running backs in order to basically boost the recruiting overall. And obviously he's a good running backs coach. There's a lot of possibilities right now in terms of what they might do on the offensive side. And again, the fact that there's going to be some shuffling on the offensive staff beyond just Dugans and Atkins is a factor here. I think a couple names that I would very strongly have on my list and potentially advocate for. If I were Mike Norvell and I were making this decision, I would be robbing Cignetti's staff up at Indiana. I would go and get Tino Sunseri who's the quarterback's coach and co-offensive coordinator up there. Sal Sunseri's son. Tino is a Jimbo Fisher protege at quarterbacks, and I've talked to Tino, and Tino knows ball. He knows quarterbacks. He's a guy that is actually going to be able I think he's a future head coach. I'll just put it that way. Tino Sunseri will be a future head coach and a future successful head coach. I would consider bringing in Tino Sunseri as my quarterbacks coach, and if I could get Mike Shanahan, who's the Indiana offensive coordinator wide receivers coach, you bring those two guys in, you hire your offensive line coach, and you say, oh, how is that going to happen? Well, Sunseri has his connections to, a few connections to Norvell, certainly connections to Tallahassee. He would be my number one quarterbacks coach option. And yes, I mentioned the Jimbo Fisher thing. I mean, look, this in the hot takes thing, there, the odds of that happening. I mean, that was me spitballing. The odds of that happening are astronomically low, right? For one thing, you'd have to get, Florida State brass, people in the athletic department and the boosters and so on to sign off on that. And I'm not sure they want to. There's a whole lot of people that would want to, but it's me making the point that all things need to be considered, and you've got to figure out what's going on in terms of getting a guy who knows what he's doing with developing quarterbacks. To me, Tino Sunseri is a guy that I would trust with that. Sunseri would be my number one choice as the quarterbacks coach. And yes, that presumes that Tokarz is not the quarterback's coach next year. I don't think he's going to be the quarterback's coach next year. We'll just leave it at that. And you've got your receivers position open. You open up your wallet and you go and get Mike Shanahan from Indiana, and you take both of those guys. To me, then you've got problem solved. Shanahan, by the way, is connected to Mike Norvell because he played wide receiver for Mike Norvell. I mean, those two guys have known each other for a long time. I mean, Norvell was his position coach back in 2011. So, I mean, that's not a crazy possibility. And here's the question. If you're Indiana, if you're those guys at Indiana, do you really think that Indiana is that your success this year is gonna carry over to next year and the year following and so on? Is your roster deep enough? Or do you take advantage of that, make the jump to Florida State and go from there? I would, those would be the two guys I would go after. And, again, the network connections make sense there. Now, I will say, and this is just so that everybody is aware, the Mike Shanahan at Indiana, who played under Mike Norvell, is not related to the NFL Shanahans. So, yeah, that's not something that is a factor here. Nevertheless, those are guys that would be on my list. We will see what happens. I mean, there's going to be major changes still beyond what we've seen. And I don't think Norvell is going to just go out and hire whomever. I think he is fully aware of the issues that they have and is going to hire guys that can recruit and develop. And how they slot in on the staff is going to matter. I think also who gets hired as your defensive coordinator and your offensive coordinator is going to have some say on other positions. So that's the other thing that makes this a little bit complicated in terms of assessing that. So a little bit of a wait and see, but those are my initial thoughts. We'll see who he's able to convince to come to Tallahassee, because again, a lot of these guys are in positions where they're already successful. They're already, they already have some job security. You're going to have to persuade them that coming to Tallahassee is going to be better for them and better for their families and for their jobs. That's going to be an uphill battle in certain cases. But I do think he's going to be able to attract some top level guys and some upgrades at these positions. And then from there, it's just a matter of how much can you support getting the best possible players through the transfer portal this year and then moving forward in recruiting. We'll go ahead and wrap there. If you've been enjoying this podcast, please leave a 5-star rating over at Apple Podcasts and wherever else you listen to podcasts. Post and repost episodes on social media and tell a friend. And if you haven't left a review in a while, do it again. It really does help the visibility of the podcast. Before we go, I'd also like to thank my advertising partners once more. That's EPR Creations, Luis Marquez of Momentum Realty in Jacksonville, Florida, Shenandoah Real Estate in the Research Triangle of North Carolina, Garage Makeovers, the #1 garage remodeling company in South Florida, and Justin Galloway of Benchmark Mortgage, serving Florida, Tennessee, and Kentucky. You can also stop by the Unconquered shop at unconqueredpodcast.com, where you can buy stickers, pins, magnets, t-shirts, and other swag. I am especially grateful for those of you at the Dynasty level. That is Brian Leininger, Dave Blair, Jack Horton, Jonathan Kennedy, Lee Caswell, Travis Smith, and Tyler Kashishki. You all are far more generous than I deserve. Thanks to you all. This has been Unconquered with Doc Staples. I'm your host, Jason Staples. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your support. I made this.